Good afternoon. Glad to be here today. I want to take you through a case study with one of our strategic clients and talk a little bit about their journey from moving from traditional governance, cost optimization and whatnot towards value realization. And it's interesting being up here presenting this topic. You know, we have all the neat buzzwords and terms that are going around: digital singularity, transformation, IT transformation, collaboration and everything. And we're here to talk about governance. And governance, if you think about it, if you want to get really sexy, just take a look over here. This is all about making sure that the Porsche, that if you haven't driven it yet, you will later, is actually being maintained, and you're getting the oil changed properly, and things are going as they are expected. And it's kind of hard to present governance in the context of being sexy and whatnot, but we're here to try and give that a shot today. My colleague and I, Anthony Cilla, there we go, are involved in learning how to manipulate the technology, are here to tell you a little bit of a story. And I'll tell you right now, if you're involved with your clients and your perception of governance, your perception of relationship management is all about getting together periodically for coffee or dinner or drinks or whatnot, you're not involved in value realization. Value realization is a transformation that's taking place in governance, where not only are we seeing a move towards automation, intelligent automation, and digital and whatnot, but it's really about transforming the way you look at governance with your suppliers. As Ed mentioned a little bit earlier in his conversation, you know, we're seeing that a lot of client relationships are moving towards a strategic provider, and that's true. But the reality of the situation is a lot of our clients are dealing with a lot of legacy things or transactional contracts that have been signed, and they're having to deal with how to stitch together and understand the value chains that exist in their clients, and understanding how the client is really trying to get value out of that relationship when you are but one cog in a large value chain. So trying to achieve a specific business outcome when you own a small little piece of the puzzle. Again, Ed's example earlier about, you know, when my system is down or whatnot, I really don't care whether or not it's a server, it's a database, it's a network connection. I need the application up. I need it when it's required. So I get the opportunity as the practice leader for managed governance services to interact with a lot of our other folks, and they talk an awful lot about the transformative aspects of things that are going on. And most people don't look at governance as being a transformative activity, but it can be, and we're going to tell you about some of those things. My colleague Anthony here is very involved with our strategic client, Freddie Mac. Anthony, why don't you introduce yourself real quick?
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm the client delivery manager at Freddie Mac. I actually have, excuse me, a unique opportunity that not only do I make sure that the relationship between Avasant and Freddie Mac is healthy, I also help them in terms of their day-to-day operations. I manage not only our services to Freddie Mac, but I also help them in guiding them in the transformative journeys that they have with all their contracts that are currently under governance, the strategy on how to bring new contracts under governance. And I'll get to it a little bit later, but we're going to talk a bit about some of the challenges that we face, some of the things that we've done to overcome those challenges in trying to get consistent governance across all the contracts. And Jim mentioned about transformation. I think governance enables a lot more transformation than most people realize. It's creating those relationships and the ability to talk about not just day-to-day operations, but to get the day-to-day operations so smooth that it's just that. It's just day-to-day activities. Now you can get to the greater conversations about what additional optimization you can provide to your clients, or what additional services you can provide. So I think we'll talk about that as we go through the rest of this conversation.
So I mentioned we're going to take you through a little story, tell you a little bit about Freddie Mac, not just as a company, but what's going on inside Freddie, some of the drivers and challenges and objectives that they had in moving forward with not only increasing their own governance capabilities, but leveraging the notion of managed governance services to help them achieve value realization. We'll talk a little bit about the services themselves and not just what they are, but how those services are specifically, give you some specific examples of how they're enabling Freddie Mac to realize the value of their various services contracts. And then we'll talk about some of the specific benefits and results. We'll have time at the end for questions. However, if you have a question along the way, please don't hesitate to interject. I'd like this to be a little bit interactive. We stand between you and the next group that's going to go out for a drive. And we're in that dangerous period post-lunch where the food coma is probably fully set in. So by all means, if you have a question, bring it forward. So Freddie, the Federal Home Loan Mortgage Corporation, affectionately known as Freddie Mac, is in fact a mortgage securitization firm. They don't originate mortgages directly, but rather they take mortgages on the market, repackage them, and sell them as securities. So they have an interesting set of organizations, departments within Freddie Mac, which I'll talk about in a second, that have to deal with a number of business challenges. One of which is the fact that Freddie is a heavily regulated entity. So not only do they have to deal with regulations from Treasury, but they also have to deal with regulations from FIFA. And so there's an awful lot of oversight and scrutiny into the things that go on with not only Freddie Mac's business, but where the providers might be involved in the delivery of that business. As well as internally, they have a very, very strong governance, risk, and compliance processes that services governance has to be able to fit into. So they have a lot of challenges in that regard, and their IT organization is a federated entity in that each of the business units has what they call a BTO that kind of serves as a quasi-business technology officer, chief information officer for that division. And their focus is to ensure that the specific applications and things that the departments need and the programs and products that they deal with receive the support from IT that they require. So IT is a shared services organization. Has to serve a lot of different masters, and there are a number of different providers in that value chain. Now, one of the other things that's very important to them is disaster recovery. And if you can imagine, Freddie Mac, they have some applications that transact $1 trillion a day. Now think about that for a second and realize how critically important that is, because not only are there direct stakeholders affected by any potential outage, but they can actually affect the markets. So their disaster recovery is extremely important, and that's one of the areas of services that they have. And lastly, within Freddie Mac, a couple of years ago, they realized that maybe we're not receiving the full value from our managed services contracts. And so we want to take a look at how we're governing those contracts and how we're extracting the value from them. So they created a new entity within their IT group called IT Managed Services. And they provide governance over all of most of the IT contracts within Freddie Mac, and have brought a whole lot of value to the organization, which we're going to take you through some of those things.
Just one more thing to add, Jim. So one thing that may not be readily apparent is Freddie Mac actually has a very robust IT organization. They do a lot of in-house, or mostly in-house applications development. So their IT spend is pretty significant. The IT presence is very big across the organization. So when we talk about the managed services contracts that we take on, there's a very critical impact, like Jim talked about, the transactions that they support, the applications that support those transactions and whatnot. So that's something that people may not know a lot about, but it is pretty critical when we talk about MGS and the value we've been able to realize at Freddie Mac.
So what were some of the drivers that led Freddie Mac to take a more focused effort on governance, to actually create an entity within IT to focus exclusively on that? Well, one of the key things that they had to deal with was they had a whole plethora of contracts that were all written and formed at a number of different times. Many of them didn't have strong levers or strong SLAs that would help direct the behaviors that Freddie Mac needed in order to achieve their business outcomes. Quite frankly, some of the value chains were probably not well understood back from the technology side all the way back to the business. And so one of the things they wanted to do was to enable that organization. About 2.5 years ago, they put it in place. They wanted to see about realizing more value from their contracts, not just specific, am I paying for what I'm getting, but more importantly, am I getting what I need in order to advance the business? And to focus more on that. They also looked at, what about our own internal capabilities? Where are we at in terms of our maturity and how much we're spending to govern these contracts, and are we realizing the things that we should be from the contracts? And then lastly, the need for more analytics. It's one thing to be able to look and say, yes, I've got my SLA reports or I've got my invoices and yes, they're being paid, but to actually be able to mine that data to start to look at things that can add value or get better value out of those contracts, specifically demand management. Are we properly aligned with the contracts? Are we providing the demand? Are we underutilizing the contracts? Are we overutilizing the contracts? Are there better ways to structure those sorts of things? And then lastly, in the area of tools and automation, a lot of dissimilarity in repositories and where things were stored and how the data was accessible, and to move forward with some common tools and to try and automate and increase efficiencies. And this was also important along the areas of around risk management, because in moving from staff augmentation or pure just technology contracts into managed services, part of the goal is to share some of that risk, to move some of that risk to the providers who are better positioned to absorb that risk in the event that there's a problem with the services. So these are all some of the drivers that led Freddie Mac to start this new ITMS organization. And their objectives were pretty straightforward. They wanted to do a better job of managing risk. They wanted to do a better job of extracting more value from the contracts. They wanted to increase their own maturity of their own capabilities and efficiencies, and to demonstrate value to the business as a strategic partner. In a lot of organizations, governance is a very passive, reactive, ornery type of organization that just simply beats the drum around compliance, but rather to be able to take that and become a strategic partner to the business so that they could realize more value from those contracts.
So I just want to take a few minutes and talk about the initial implementation of governance or MGS services at Freddie Mac. We really focused on a couple of key areas as the primary outcomes that they were looking for in terms of governance and the implementation of MGS. One was around best practices. That's what one of their key factors was. We want to have industry best practices across governance, across our contracts. The other area was in terms of repeatability, scalability, discipline, and the ability to kind of grow with the business demand. So as we went through the initial onset of implementation, we did an operational alignment activity. Within that operational alignment activity, we quickly realized that governance, as it was originally being performed by the business organizations that were receiving the contract services, now coming under the ITMS umbrella, there was not a great deal of consistency in terms of how they were managing their meetings, how the contracts were being managed from an SLA perspective. The financial components of the contracts were inconsistent. So we really wanted to make sure and focus on the implementation and consistency there. We also recognized that there were some operational alignment activities in terms of doing the day-to-day transactional activities. We realized that there's a couple of governance components, or I should say risk and compliance components. The business controls were not necessarily being identified and incorporated within the processes. Being a highly regulated organization, they have a governance risk and compliance requirement that we had to make sure was met. And then we also saw some opportunities for immediate optimization. So we eliminated some duplication of checks and balances. We streamlined and integrated some of the business organizations, such as their legal department, procurement department, and so forth. Additionally, we focused on the reporting aspect of things and documentation. So one of the things that Avasant brings to the table is a proprietary governance tool called Avasant. So implementing Avasant across all the contracts created the ability to decompose the contracts in a similar fashion, put all the attributes into our system, and then as we implemented governance for each contract, you can have readily available information and visibility across all the different aspects of the services. Do you have anything else to add?
I would just add to that, particularly around, part of the onboarding of the services involved getting an understanding of the contracts. And so as new contracts are added under the services, it's important not just to understand the specific attributes, the terms and conditions, deliverables and obligations of the contracts themselves, but again, more importantly, what was the value you were trying to get from this contract in the first place? Where does it fit into the big picture of what we were trying to accomplish from a business perspective? And so it provided the opportunity to facilitate some very interesting discussions around the contracts themselves, getting better aligned with the suppliers. In some cases, the governance hadn't been as consistently applied along the way. And so, client satisfaction with some of the suppliers has improved over time as both parties have fully understood not only the terms and conditions of the contract, but the intended value from those contracts as well.
So in terms of enabling value realization through managed services, I want to talk about this in three different areas. One being the perspective of the service provider and really the business organization. ITMS is a shared services organization, deals with service providers as well as their business customers. The other is from the perspective of ITMS, and then lastly from the perspective of MGS. When we look at it from the perspective of the service providers, governance in and of itself was a significant value, a significant benefit to create a standardized ability to have discussions on a regular basis and understand what the measurements were and that everybody was talking about the same attributes. I'll use performance governance as an example. You guys talk about SLAs ad nauseum, I'm sure, with your clients. How do you get past the discussion about the specific, metrics that you met that month and get to a conversation that's more about how do I avail the client of my services more strategically? How do I get past conversations about whether I met or missed a specific metric or a specific SLA and get to conversations about how do I optimize our process, or how do I look at some of the things that Kevin talked about in the beginning of our presentation and help the clients understand not just what the industry is heading towards, but how I can support them as a potential strategic partner. In terms of forecasting, for example, so the consistent visibility for demand and consumption, our forecasting and actual reporting, was something that was a significant value that we feel the service providers resonated regularly, as well as the business organization. Understanding what the next 3 months, 6 months, 1 year look like in terms of projected business, projected activities. You guys could then, or the service providers were able to prepare their resources better, prepare their business plans and things more accurately, and then on a regular basis look at the actuals, the consumption of services, to see where are we in terms of tracking towards those forecasts, and have better conversations about am I meeting your business objectives? Am I meeting my business objectives? And where there may be deltas. In terms of ITMS, one of the exercises when we first bring a contract under governance is called a decomposition. So we take all the contract attributes and we load it into the system, and we put it into our governance tools. But in that exercise, we also do what's called a gap and risk assessment. We take contract best practices and we assess them on a standardized scale that says, okay, how much is this contract in alignment with industry best practices? And then we score it based upon how far outside of best practices those contracts are. That's information that we share across the whole entire organization. We share that with their legal department, their procurement department. This gives us insights as to what immediate concerns might we have in our relationship with our service providers or in the business organization's consumption of the services. Also, it enables conversations that, when we go for a contract renewal, or in some cases when we go for a recompete, how do we better bring those contracts into best practice compliance? And how do we address and mitigate any of the risks and issues that there may be imposed? We also looked at the metrics and the analytical capabilities that were now enabled because you have standardization across all your contracts. You have a standard framework, and the Avasant tool captures a lot of different metrics. Our processes capture a lot of different metrics that now we have that capability to have conversations about, well, how well are we actually performing? And then how well do we want to perform 6 months from now? So that was a significant value. And then now we're also able to report out to the business organization, the executives. That's been a significant value add in the last several months even, as they look towards their 2017 and 2018 projections. We could have conversations with our strategic partners as we try to build for the future. Lastly, from the perspective of MGS, I'll look at MGS more from the viewpoint of the conduit that all of the benefits we've been discussing today, or that I've discussed in this presentation and Jim shared with you. MGS has been the conduit to make that happen. We may not be doing it organically as a result of governance, but because governance is in place, we're not talking about some of the minute challenges on a day-to-day basis. We may be, but that's not the focus. The focus is overall making sure the relationship's healthy, and we're able to have those conversations about how do we optimize our business? How do we look at strategy going into the future? How can my customer be aware of what tools and services that I have that may benefit them in the future, so on and so forth.
Two things I want to add to that. So from a provider standpoint, one of the challenges I think this presents to you is you think about engaging on your contracts or renewals and whatnot, you need to be thinking more along the lines of the value change and the value realization that your clients are trying to achieve, but also be thinking about, you know, the contracts themselves that you're going to sign. Are you working with your clients to make sure that those are best practice contracts so that coming out of the gate, and talk about this a little bit more in a second, you know, the best governance is the governance that's orchestrated at contract transition and not after the fact. This is one of those cases where the old adage, there's never enough time to do it right the first time, but enough time to go back and do it again. Well, very often, if transition is not done successfully and governance is not orchestrated and implemented successfully, you may be in a situation where you're in a fouled relationship right out of the gate. And sometimes those are very, very difficult to overcome, to recover from. So as you can see, there are a lot of different ways in which just the delivery of governance through managed governance services has contributed to helping Freddie Mac achieve value realization in their contracts. It's enabled them to increase their own capabilities and maturity in what they do. It's helped in the relationship with their various service providers so that now much more time is spent focused on getting the intended business outcomes that contract may be related to, rather than arguing over whether or not a red, yellow, green chart has the right colors in the right places. And being able to bring in what is traditional transactional governance sort of data and begin to look at it from a broader perspective and take a look at their own internal demand, how they're consuming those services, what are the things that the client needs to do in order to change to optimize the value of this relationship. You know, the fun with managed services is a two-way street. You need the client to come alongside with what you're delivering, how it needs to be delivered, and I think as one of the other speakers, you need to be able to effectively push back and bring thought leadership to the table to ensure that the client is doing the things that they need to do in order to optimize the value from those relationships. Here we go. So, in the course of about 2 years, it's been a journey, as I mentioned in the beginning. You know, in the industry, different statistics depending on who you're speaking to. You know, it's roughly between 7 and 9% of annual contract value that is spent on just governance. You know, some more, some less. And in the last 2 years, Freddie Mac has been able to drive down their total cost of governance to roughly around 4%. And so they're very efficient, very cost effective. There have been several key processes that have been aligned with the business and the governance processes that have enabled them over time to realize about $6 million in value leakage recovery from the contracts that they have. And so you can see that there's some very quantifiable benefits that not only for the client, but also for the provider. And how important it is that as providers, you keep your eye on the ball, on the big picture, and ensure that, encourage your clients to establish good governance if they don't have it already, and to make it as easy as possible for your clients to govern you. So a number of lessons learned and kind of bring us to a close here. So right now within Freddie Mac, ITMS is the model for managed services governance across the enterprise. People are looking to ITMS and saying, we've got some managed services things we've got going on, some BPO contracts and things. How can we best take what you guys are doing and realize those benefits for ourselves? As I mentioned earlier, governance is best operationalized and orchestrated during the contract implementation. So if you as a provider are in the middle of an implementation and you don't see the stand-up of a transition management office or the implementation, the orchestration of governance as part of that, you need to bring that up. Because I assure you, as soon as you move from the transition phase into steady state, those things will start to rear their ugly head. Process and organizational change is not easy. But what we see in a lot of organizations is that they think contract management is governance. Contract management is just executing on T's and C's and just simply trying to keep the lights on, keep the client happy, not necessarily satisfied, but happy, rather than taking a look at the supplier governance, the relationship management aspect of governance. As I said earlier, if your whole definition of relationship management is about going out for drinks with your client, you're missing the opportunity to use governance to help you not only get your client get better value out of their contract, but also for you to be able to become that strategic partner to your client to help them transform, do the things that they need to do from a business perspective. And that's really where ITMS is today within Freddie Mac. They're viewed as a strategic partner. They don't own the end-to-end procurement chain from soup to nuts, but they are involved all the way from helping the business areas with their requirements, gathering those requirements in an effective way so that they're focused on the business outcomes and not just some of the IT sort of metrics that you typically see. They're helping with procurement, around sourcing strategy, and then once contracts are implemented, helping them to ensure that those contracts are achieving the value that they were intended to in the first place. So value realization is really driving some transformation in the area of governance. In the past, you were providers. Now you need to be strategic business partners. And even though you may not own the services for the full scope of a value chain from soup to nuts, you really need to be that strategic business partner to point out where things can get better, where the focus needs to be. The focus is on business outcomes. As Ed mentioned earlier, the IT-specific outcomes are nice. They're important, but from a business perspective, they're interested in the business outcomes. Moving again from cost optimization. Not that that's not important. Clients are looking for year-over-year benefits in terms of this relationship, but also, how do I realize more value out of this relationship? Moving beyond just simply contract compliance and bringing in the provider periodically to discuss their reports and beat them up, but rather to talk about how do we enable this? What are the things that we're doing right? What are the things that we need to do better? How can we better align with you? Really seeing governance become much more proactive. In the past, a lot of reactive, a lot of ad hoc activities, and very passive, but now being able to produce actionable information on a periodic basis so that business decisions can be made based on the results of governance. And focus on this here around analytics. Analytics are emerging as a game changer even in the area of governance. We heard in one of the earlier presentations today how important analytics are in terms of healthcare and healthcare outcomes and whatnot. The same is true from a governance standpoint. Being able to look at not only the transactional governance details, but to step back and say, okay, what are the real trends and what do they mean? Not just from a pure data perspective, but how do they translate into meaning of value? And so more and more analytics are being asked for. And SLA reporting and invoice reconciliation stuff, that's all table stakes. You've got to have that. But how can you help your client better understand the metrics that are being produced, whether they're actual key performance indicators formally written into a contract, or whether they're just operational metrics that are being provided? How can you help your client better understand what those are? And that's what they're looking for. They're the low-hanging fruit in terms of outsourcing to help provide those sorts of analytics. So in the end, again, this little journey that Freddie Mac has been on for the last 2 years, they've come a long way. They have positioned themselves, as I said, as the leader within the organization, the example of what managed services governance can do. They have really continued to realize not just the value of their individual contracts, but as they position the organization to start thinking differently about services and focused on those business outcomes and establishing the value chains along the way. Now, we are fortunate in that we have our sponsor here with us today, John Borgelt, the Senior Director from Freddie Mac's ITMS organization, is here along with a couple members of his staff, Encore and Kathy. They'll be around if you want to ask specific questions to them one-on-one about anything having to do with the case study and what Freddie Mac is doing. It's been a real pleasure and a blessing to have been working with Freddie Mac for these last couple of years on this journey with them. And hopefully you've been able to glean something from our presentation today about how moving from just simple relationship management, cost optimization, towards value realization will help not only your clients but also you as providers reap the benefits of your relationships with your clients. Thank you.